So today the church begins placing a new theme in front of us, a theme for us to pay attention to for the next several weeks. We all know where we've been. Like we started off with the very beginning part of this whole thing, which is when Jesus shows up, called Christmas. Okay, good. So we start with Christmas, and then Jesus starts growing up in Nazareth, and then all of a sudden he kind of bursts onto the scene, and it's like, okay, he's doing miracles, he's giving his teachings, beautiful stuff. And then at a certain point, he invites the disciples to share in his mission with him, to share his job. So he sends them out, and they actually start doing miracles. They come back, and he says, all right, now we need to start talking about this kingdom thing. They start talking about this kingdom of God, and we talked about that for several weeks. But now, in Matthew's gospel especially, Matthew gets to a part of his gospel where he's not just writing a story. Like this isn't like a day-by-day account of Jesus' life. This isn't a journal entry. Matthew's very intentionally crafted how he's telling the story so that he can make certain points and he can lead us and guide us where we need to go. At this point in Matthew's account, it's not so much, all right, Jesus was born, these are Jesus' teachings. Matthew's been kind of driving us to this certain point where he's saying, okay, now the question is, can you trust him? Do you trust him? Did other people trust him? After they saw all of this, after they heard all of the teachings, what was their response to him? How did they take it? Because again, think of it, we kind of take a lot of things for granted. We come to church and we're just like, well, I believe in Jesus. What do you want from me, Father? Here I am. But think about how certain people respond about Jesus today. They'll say, oh, Jesus, yeah, that's nice. He's a good little teacher. Taught me to be a better person. But I don't need to give my life to him or anything. Like, let's pump the brakes, Father. I got a life to live. I'll be at church on Sunday. I'll see you there. Even people in Jesus' time, they're like, hey, Jesus, that's kind of a weird teaching, but I get that one, and that one's, I don't like that, but then you said this, I like that. So they'd kind of pick and choose. Even back when Jesus was walking around, they'd pick and choose what they liked, kind of go with what they wanted to. But then at the end of the day, a lot of people would say, yeah, but I'm going home now. I'm not going to follow you around anymore. It's the people in Jesus' hometown. They were like, Jesus, we grew up with you. What you're saying is a little weird. The responses to Jesus are never just, oh, he's a nice guy. And then we just kind of move on with our life. No, Jesus kind of demands a decision. And what Jesus is asking for is pretty specific. And that's kind of the crux of the matter. And that's what Matthew's trying to get us towards. That's what his gospel is driving us towards in this part. Because Jesus doesn't just ask us to believe his teachings or to agree with his teachings. He doesn't just ask us if we're going to follow some more of his rules and be better people. Jesus asks one simple thing first and foremost. And then everything else flows from that. Jesus asks us the question, do you trust me? The biblical word for that is, do you have faith in me? Will you place your faith in me? And that's what he's driving at. I've told this example and story before, but I'm going to tell it again because it's one of my favorites. There's this very famous French acrobat. His name is Charles Blondin. Chuck, as we call him. Chuck was very famous for doing a lot of things, but his most famous thing is he was the one that would walk the tightrope across Niagara Falls. That was his big trick. So this is almost 200 years ago when people still thought that was cool. Nowadays, we're just like, lame. Do something cooler, man. But back then, they were like, that's awesome. And it was so easy for him. He'd do it on stilts. He'd do it on a bicycle. He came up with a lot of creative ways to walk across the tightrope, and people were thrilled. One day, he started pushing a wheelbarrow across this tightrope, and he filled it with rocks just to show how easy he could make this. And so about his fourth or fifth time across the rope, he comes back to the crowd that's watching him, and he goes, all right, do you think I can do this again? And everyone's just like, yeah, duh, easy. He's like, do you think that I'm going to make it the next time? Yeah, man, duh. Do you think that if even I put a person in here, I could make it across the rope? They're like, yeah, person's lighter than your rocks. You could probably do that. I definitely think you can do that. And he goes, great. Dumps out the rocks and says, somebody jump in. And everyone immediately says, no. Why? Easily we're like, well, it's because, Father, like, have you ever been to Niagara Falls? Have you ever been on a tightrope suspended above Niagara Falls? That's scary. So we immediately think it's fear that keeps people away. And that's understandable. It's very understandable. But actually, there's something else that's keeping them away. And it's this thing called a lack of faith. They're all at the show. They all know that he can do it. They've seen it. They know this guy, seen him do it, have no doubt that he's going to make it across, back and forth. But they're not ready to participate in that. They're not ready to place their life into this guy's hands. And that's what we call a lack of faith. They know everything, know the right answers, they know the stuff. But what they can't do is place their life into his hands. And that's what we call a lack of faith. Typically what we do is we get the order wrong. We're like, they're afraid, so that's why they can't trust. But no, the issue is if they trusted him, if they truly trusted him, if they could place their faith in him, they would have hopped in the wheelbarrow without questions. It's just like, yeah, man, I know you can do this. I trust you. They'd hop in, no problems. But because there was a lack of faith, a lack of trust, they couldn't do it. The beautiful thing of this is there's been a lot of advances in both psychology and neurobiology that actually kind of proves this true. And it proves Jesus' point true. We're going to get to Jesus' point. It proves Jesus true as well. Like, for instance, there's this great psychologist. Her name's Dr. Sue Johnson. And she's done a lot of her work on this thing called attachment theory, which is a fancy way of talking about how humans form relationships, how humans form bonds. What it is that keeps people linked together on that very deep and personal level. So, for instance, what she would do is she'd take a couple that was just, in a long-term committed relationship, and that had this sort of a bond between them, this firmly and securely attached sort of a couple. But what she'd then do is she'd recognize that when there was a threat to this relationship, so especially this would be like couples counseling, when a threat had been introduced to the relationship, or when this relationship was being threatened by some outside source, whatever that may be, she'd do this with the brain scans, and you would go into what was called a primal panic. In other words, it's not anything you had to think through. Your limbic system, your nervous system would start making an automatic response to whenever this very close relationship was threatened. Your limbic system would fire up the amygdala in your brain, which is, as we all know, is the section of the brain that controls fear, of course. So once this deep and tight relationship is threatened, or when it begins breaking apart, what happens is your brain goes into fear mode. The other cool thing, though, is what? The opposite of this is also true. If you're in a situation that should cause great fear, if you're in a situation that threatens to inflict some sort of pain upon you, and even in situations that do cause pain, if you're in that situation with a person that you have that deep and close personal bond with, if you're in that situation with a person you have a deep and profound relationship with, guess what? Your nervous system doesn't start firing up your amygdala. In other words, you don't experience fear, at least not to the same extent. So again, think back to the Charles Blondin. People couldn't get in the wheelbarrow, not so much because they were afraid of the situation, but because they couldn't trust him. Because if they truly trusted him, fear wouldn't have been the issue. If they actually trusted him and could entrust their life to him, the issue of fear wouldn't even be an issue. So this is where we can look at the gospel for today and see that all this really fits in and comes alive. And it's very easy for us to think of this scene with Jesus and Peter walking on the water like another one of those ta-da moments of Jesus where he's just like, look what I can do. But that's not what's going on. Not at all. Jesus has been with the disciples for quite a while now. Probably a couple of years by this point. They've been living with him, hanging out with him, done a ton of stuff with him, seen all the miracles, heard all the teachings. They know it all. Actually, a couple of chapters before this, they even saw him calm a stormy sea. So this is like in their memory of, yeah, this is what Jesus does. He can do this one. And yet, what happens, right? The disciples are struggling against this storm all night, and what happens? They see him arriving, and so his very presence should calm them down. That's what the science tells us. If they have this deep relationship with him that they're supposed to at this point, they should be all fear should wash away. They should just be like, oh, this is great. We were so scared because of what's happened. Now Jesus is here. It's going to be okay. And yet, what are we told? They saw him, and they were still terrified. Still terrified. Even Peter, when Peter starts walking on water, Peter continues to be afraid. Is it because of the storm? No. What does the science tell us? Here's this person that he should have a deep and profound connection with, a deep and profound relationship with. This should drive out fear. And yet he continues to be afraid. And what does Jesus call him out on? Does Jesus yell at Peter, Peter, why are you afraid? Jesus says, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Jesus knows how your system works, how your body works. He knows how we feel. He knows if Peter's afraid, that means he doesn't trust him. That means that Peter has not entrusted his life to him. This is what Jesus is getting at. This is the issue. Always, always, always. It's that we hear the teachings, people see the miracles. We know all about the Jesus guy, and yet we're afraid to actually do this. Why? Because at something at a much deeper level, if we admit it to ourselves, we don't actually trust him. I've told you this before, like my own personal experience in life. Like when I felt this call to be a priest, I was so scared. Why? Because I could give you 15 reasons why being a priest would be scary. And yet, what should have that revealed to me? The issue is not those 15 things that make being a priest a little scary. The issue is I didn't trust Jesus. I didn't actually trust him. I knew what he taught. I knew all the things I had to do to be a good person. And yet when Jesus asked me to do something for my own good, for my own happiness, to fulfill my mission and purpose in life, when he asked me for something like that, I was like, heck no, not going to do that. Initially, here I am today. Initially, I was like, heck no. Why? Because at a much deeper level, I didn't trust him. I didn't. Even today, like when I feel God asking me to do certain things or calling me to do certain things, and I feel a certain sense of fear about doing it, that's where it's kind of annoying at this point. I'm just like, shoot, I thought I trusted Jesus a lot more. But still, like you notice those parts of your life where when Jesus asks you to do something, you're like, ugh. And it shows what? Maybe I don't trust him as much as I think I do. Go to church, know all these teachings, know what I need to do to be a good person, but do I actually trust him? Am I ready to entrust my life to him? That's the question for each one of us. That's kind of the big challenge. Not just knowing the teachings, not just following the laws, but it's a challenge of, can I trust this man? Do I entrust my life to him? Or do I just kind of trust myself and hold on to it myself? This is what Jesus is after. This is what he's longing for. This is what he needs from us. Honestly, this is what our heart is looking for, is someone that we can entrust our life to. Because when we do that, fear is driven out. All of a sudden, everything in our life comes together. When we enter into that deep and abiding relationship with Christ himself, everything begins to change. But this is where we have to do that self-reflection. Am I actually entrusting my life to Jesus? Or am I just sprinkling some Jesus stuff on top of my life? Am I ready to entrust my life to him or not? If Jesus were to ask me to do something, if something were to come along and Jesus says, I want you to do X, Y, or Z, would I respond in fear or would I respond with, yeah, Lord, anything you ask, I trust you. Even if it's difficult, even if it's this, that, or the other, I trust you. That is for my good, and I trust that you're going to take care of me. Or do we start responding in fear? This is the question we have to ask, and what Matthew and where our church is leading us for these next several weeks is that question of faith. Am I entrusting my life to him, or am I holding on to it? This is what he calls us to do, to place our life into his hands, to get into his wheelbarrow, and to place our life into his hands.